keeping a beginner's mind is important. Like, what's the hello world at this level? Every time you go up a level, you have to figure out, like, what's the hello world of X?
Welcome to our first episode of Ready for Dev, where we answer the real questions in software development. My name is Raymond, and today we are joined by my good friend Robbie, who is an engineering team lead and holds a master's in mathematics. Let's just say he's the friend we all wanted for those of us who study computer science in university. Welcome to the show, Robbie. How are you
Hey,
doing?
thanks, Ray. Happy to be here. It's a
Yeah.
very generous introduction.
We've known you for how long now? About 2 years now, at least?
More, yeah, it's been, I think, almost 3 years that
Yeah,
we've known each other. Yeah,
yeah, that's amazing.
time flies by for sure.
Yeah, very good.
We both are married to Ray and I both have some funny things in common, like from when we met. Yeah, like we both our wives are from the Philippines, and so we both connected on interesting levels when we first met. And yeah, Ray was a mentor of sorts to me when I first started out programming. My first introduction to programming was actually through data science, and it was Ray who sort of turned me on to just pure software development when we first met. And so yeah, we've been pretty tight ever since. And I know this year it's been harder to keep in touch just because of COVID and all that, but
Yep.
yeah, we've kept in touch for the last 3 years, and had good laughs,
Oh
shared a
yeah.
bunch of good laughs, and yeah.
Definitely, definitely.
I'm
All right.
happy to be your episode 0. So
Yep. Cool. Episode 0.
I'm excited. Yeah.
Amazing. All right. So today's topic poses the question: how do you stay motivated to keep learning and teaching yourself? It's like you're in a role and you go through the daily ins and outs, but you may not be learning much. So now this applies not just to developers, but also QAs, designers, product owners, and even managers. So the big question we want to probably start with is like why? Why is self-motivation and continuous learning so important as a developer, and why even
Yeah.
bother?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So, I actually, you know, I actually taught for a few years, as a part-time job when I was in school. And so, I had to interact with students as a teaching assistant during school. And learning, just the whole topic of learning, I find is very it's something that I'm very passionate about. And so yeah, from a motivational standpoint, there's something that there's a buzz term sort of in education called beginner's mind, right? Always having a beginner's mind. And I find that when you are looking at staying motivated, a lot of it just boils down to that, keeping an open mind, remaining curious, sometimes even just keeping track of keeping sort of like a question log, right? A log of things that you're curious about. That's where I would start the conversation. There's obviously a lot of areas that we can go into more depth, but I
Yep.
just kind of wanted to start it there, which is that it's easy to feel like you can start to coast. I find once you've become proficient enough in a particular area that you're right. Like there is a motivational aspect to it, but I find that keeping a beginner's mind is important. Like there's a scientist, Richard Feynman, who really inspired me. Like when I was in school, he's a famous physicist. I encourage anyone listening to look into him. He was a very interesting individual. Like he progressed the field of quantum mechanics quite a bit, but he was this really playful individual. Like he was always felt like he took like a childlike perspective to any new topic, right?
Right.
And when you listen to him talking about physics, you feel like you're talking to someone who maybe just started learning physics, not in his level of understanding, but just in the way he talks about it, the level of excitement, and talking about, um, why when you're looking at a water droplet, does it maintain its shape on a hard surface? Like just an innocent question like that, he'll go for 30 minutes chatting about it. And I remember Ray specifically, when I first met him, I had a lot of questions like that myself about programming, and I think that's what started our friendship, because I feel like Ray was taken maybe by the type of questions that I asked him, and I
Yep.
think that's something that he and I both have in common, right? You and I both have in common,
Yep.
and so yeah, it's just I think that's a good starting point for the conversation. Like, never lose that sense of curiosity, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes it takes time to kind of connect with that, right? To
Right.
connect with that, to be sort of in touch with what, because we all have natural, like, things that we're naturally curious about. Um, but sometimes it's a muscle that you have to exercise, right? If you're not used to having that kind of state of mind, it's something
Yep.
that keeping a curiosity journal, things of that nature. If you're finding it hard to connect with things that you're sort of naturally curious about, maybe like you said, if you're a designer. I remember when I first started learning CSS, because I was primarily a backend developer, and it took a while for me to figure out what the right questions were to ask. And then I landed on the box model,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And it was like, okay, this makes sense. This is where I should start, right?
Yeah.
But getting to that point of figuring out like what the right question was to ask, took me maybe a week, 2 weeks to kind of, do some research and say, okay, if you want to learn CSS properly, starting with the box model is a good place to start. And
Yep.
there's this thing too about like, um, it can feel overwhelming sometimes as well when we're talking about motivation.
Hmm.
um, Part of what demotivates people, I think, sometimes is that they feel maybe the subject is too big for them to
Right.
grasp, or you know that kind of
That's a good point. Yeah.
theme. And so yeah, and so there's this hilarious, like, I'm a big Elon Musk fan. I know that he has some personality quirks. That's okay, but he's a big fan of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He mentions that in a lot of his interviews, and I'm a fan of it too. And he makes reference to 42. Like, anyone who's read that book
Hmm.
knows that that's sort of something from the book. And where that comes from is, they build this big machine. Sorry, I'm going on a small tangent
It's
here,
all
but
good.
there's a point to be made, which is like, they build this big machine because they're trying to figure out the meaning to the universe, life, and everything, right? And it's this giant computer, so it has some tech related themes, because they sort of hint at this algorithm. They've built this algorithm to figure out what the meaning of life is, and so it goes on for hundreds of years doing this computation, and then it goes through the generations, right, until
Hmm.
finally it spits out the answer, and the answer ends up being 42. And everyone's so frustrated. They're like, we've waited all this time for an answer. What the hell does this mean? And the machine responds, it's like, well, maybe you didn't ask the right question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe this is the wrong question to ask. And it's like a very deep meaning, right? Where
Yep.
sometimes we just don't know what the right questions are to ask, right? Like I said, when I first started learning CSS as a backend developer who's interested in web development, 1 year later, I've written a React Native app, a React application, I've become proficient at CSS, but I didn't know, to ask about the box model, right?
Right.
And
Right.
and so, sometimes, that's kind of where you need to start from a motivational standpoint too, right? Is like, what are the
Hmm.
right questions to ask? And sometimes you need people who have gone down that path before,
Yep.
right? To help you accelerate that process.
Definitely.
But you'd be
Definitely.
surprised, right? I mean, there's people who, they've been in a certain field for a long time, and sometimes they need someone who has a fresh perspective to ask questions that maybe they haven't even thought of asking before, right?
Yep.
So
For
anyways,
sure.
that's kind of my it's something
Yeah.
obviously I'm passionate about, right? Because
Right.
I'm very passionate about learning and finding ways to optimize the learning process and whatnot. And so anyways,
Hmm.
I'll give the floor back to you. Yeah.
It's all good. So I would argue almost that to be a developer or to be in the IT industry, you have to have that motivation to be successful. Because I've seen so many developers that they learn something, they finish their schooling, they get a job, maybe they learn a bit on that job, but once they reach that peak of, I guess, expertise in whatever they've learned, they stop there And they
Yeah.
like you. I find in this industry you can't just stop there, especially if you want to be able to keep moving up the ladder or progress as a
Yeah.
developer or whatever it is you're trying to do. In this industry, like if you're not continuously learning, you're going to be left behind.
It's
So
true.
even when I like do a lot of interviewing of candidates and things like that, like that's one of the key factors I look for, because to me it's such a big factor in this industry.
No, absolutely. I mean, for sure, there's a utilitarian angle, right, to take, which is very valid, right? And it's true. I mean, the industry is changing so rapidly, and if you don't have your finger on the pulse, it is easy to fall behind. And I'm sort of a more of an idealist, where I like to think that I can get myself to be motivated by non-utilitarian motives. But you're 100% right. I mean, there's a reason, when I was learning web development, even though I was learning the fundamentals that are somewhat, framework agnostic, that, I went with React because, that's the mainstream, framework. But
Hmm.
again, I didn't blindly adapt it, right? It was the question of like, okay, how does this work differently than other web frameworks, right? Again, it goes back to asking the right questions,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
How does and again, when I found out about DOM diffing algorithms and virtual DOMs and things of that nature, and the way that React handles, let's say, like uh, data fetching and things of that nature, as opposed to Angular, let's say, or,
Hmm.
or Svelte or
Right.
other web frameworks, it's sort of it's a balancing act, right? Where you're learning things for utilitarian purposes for sure,
Hmm.
but then again, you're hoping that because even that can become, they have this thing called JS fatigue. You heard of
Yeah.
that term, JS
Oh
fatigue,
man.
where, yeah, where, every year something new comes out and
Yeah.
you feel like you have to learn it. And I agree 100% that we shouldn't allow ourselves to become complacent, and that we should learn it to stay relevant. But there is, I think, a point to be made, which is that, like, to do it conscientiously,
Right.
right? To do it conscientiously, so that,
Yeah.
because I find, especially with some older developers, I'm not being ageist or anything, but like, especially with some older developers, they become sort of bitter about
Hmm.
the fact that, they've been around long enough to see, 10 frameworks come and go, or 10, tools
Yeah.
come and go. But to me, it's like, well, when you went from framework 5 to 6, there was 100%, there's a reason for it,
Hmm.
right? There's no global optimum
Right.
for a lot of these things, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
When you're looking at how these things are evolving, they're evolving for a reason, right? And that's why I don't get bitter, right, about the fact that I have to learn new things, or don't have to, but choose to learn new things as they change, because the fact of the matter is that, like, they're changing for a reason.
Hmm.
If you know things were good enough the way they were, like, there's this funny meme where there's a comic where this guy's asking the developer, what are you doing with those 4 kilobytes of memory? And the guy respond. You've seen this one?
No, no,
He
it sounds funny
responds.
though.
He's asking him this question: what are you doing with those 4 kilobytes of memory? And the guy responds, sending people to the moon. Right. And then in the frame below, they're asking, what are you doing with that, like, 1 gig of memory? And the guy's like, running Slack.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. I look at that comic. Someone else might look at that comic and say, oh, those were the good old days, right? When you
Hmm.
could do so much, you could send
Yeah.
people to the moon with 4 kilobytes of memory. But the thing is, try running Slack with 4 kilobytes of memory.
Right. Right.
It will not work, right? And so, you know what I mean? Like, when you're looking at things like Electron, for example, and people building desktop apps in Electron, it's like, okay, is that the optimal way of doing things? Maybe not,
Yeah.
right? But is there a better way currently? Is there a more efficient way? You know what I mean? To
Yeah.
build cross-platform applications, like,
Yeah. The same
that,
speed
that,
and
that
things
that's
like
the
that.
only point
Yeah.
I'd make there. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Like for the argument for your Electron, like yeah, it's maybe not be the optimum way to build a desktop app, but it's probably the quickest way to build a cross-platform desktop app, right?
Great.
So in terms of like getting product to market, as fast as possible, it probably is the best option for that currently,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. And it, might mean that you have to learn something new,
Hmm.
but what's your goal, right? What's your aim?
Yep.
And and that's where, again, like, I'm in 100% agreement with you that, as long as you're doing so conscientiously, it is important to continuously learn and continuously improve.
Yep.
Um,
So
Sorry, there
if you
isn't any background noise, right? Should I
no,
move
you're all
and
good.
just,
You're good.
I'm all good? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I wanted to make a note of, and it's something I don't know if we should argue for or against, but there's other industries where continuous learning is a standard, right? It's expected of people that are in that industry. So some of the examples
Right.
I have are like healthcare, even information security, and then even the finance industry. So do you
Right.
think that someone should be mandating that developers should be, every year have to contribute a certain number of learning credits or acquire a certain number of learning credits every year to show that they're continuously learning? You think there's
Right.
an argument for that for developers?
Yeah, I really like that idea, actually. I mean, there's some companies that, devote 1 day out of every 2 weeks to exploratory development or
Hmm.
exploratory learning for that purpose, right? They want developers to, I mean, in those cases that I've heard, it's usually more for creative reasons. Like, they
Hmm.
want people to have time where they can, be creative and brainstorm their own ideas. But for sure, I mean, I agree. When it's funny, so my dad's an engineer and a civil engineer, and they have some aspects of their industry that have not changed very much over the last few decades. But even there, they have conferences that they go to.
Hmm.
I know you and I are big advocates of conferences. That's something that I know COVID had an impact on. But
Yeah.
even virtual conferences have become popular now. And it's true. I mean, setting the expectation, setting the standard, where an employee could potentially get evaluated based on their how current they're keeping their knowledge, and giving them the opportunity to do so as well, right?
Hmm.
Because it depends on the organization as well, right? some
Totally.
some
Yeah.
organizations are themselves kind of biased to doing things in certain ways, right? and
Right.
and so it's very much like a culture thing. But I agree, I mean, that's part of a healthy culture in an organization, which is to be open to adopting new ideas, being open to adopting new um, solutions, to
Exactly.
problems. Like, I know GraphQL was something that you were really interested in at one point. And
Yep.
and it's another, excuse me, it's another example of a different paradigm, right? A paradigm shift that is useful once you've made the migration. But you know I remember watching this video clip about how NPM moved to Rust
Hmm.
for their backend applications. And the whole talk was how to sell Rust to your company, right? Really. And it was interesting
Yeah.
because it's one of these things, again, where at the organizational level, I would argue even that it's important, right?
Hmm.
Even beyond just the developers themselves, I feel like organizations need to consistently sort of reevaluate their direction technologically, right?
Right.
And even people at the leadership level to consistently be expected to learn, right?
Hmm.
I think learning is like one of the basic parts of being human, right? I think that, and it's one of these things. That's why I chose this topic for this episode, when you asked me what I'd like to chat about,
Yeah.
because I think it's something that needs to be protected at all costs, right? I mean, and it's so easy to lose it, especially as you move up the ladder, right? In a company, sometimes different things become relevant, different variables become relevant. But there's Auth0, this company, this authentication as a service company. The CEO, he has this article where he's talking about how, although he's a CEO, like he's consistently learning. He's still an engineer at heart, right?
Right.
Even though he's not always coding anymore.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, learning, I think it should be something that's expected of everyone in an organization, right?
Right.
Again, it needs to be supported, it needs to be fostered in the right way,
Yeah.
to balance it with, your ordinary, work responsibilities. But I 100% I agree that's something that it should be expected of everyone in an organization, including the
Right.
leadership level. Yeah.
Right. So probably the next point I have here is how do you teach yourself more in-depth topics, given that most of the material that's out there is on the introductory level. So there's so many tutorials of like how to get started, React for
Yeah.
beginners, things like that. Where
Yeah.
how do you get to learn a topic more in depth? Like what strategies have you used to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is something that, and again, I'll name drop a few people
Sure.
because it's something I've thought about a lot, right? And so, there's this book called I think it's called The 4 Hour Chef by Tim Ferriss,
Hmm. I've heard of it.
where it's on the surface of a book about learning, excuse me, a book about cooking, but
Hmm.
it's actually a book about how to learn anything, basically, right?
Yeah.
He's not the only one I'll mention on this question, but I'll just start there. And the first step that he mentions is like the deconstruction step, right? So anytime you're trying to learn a new topic, typically in the beginning, you're sort of deconstructing the topic. You're trying to figure out, what are the main what are the main topics, subtopics in this topic,
Hmm.
right? Because if you imagine it sort of as a tree with many different branches, any subject, you're never going to get to the leaves of that tree, right?
Hmm.
It's almost like you'd have to maybe get a PhD to get to the leaf. and,
Right.
and even there sometimes it's hard to get all the way to the bottom of the tree, right? And
Right.
so you start sort of at the top, and you're trying to figure out, what are the children from this node, right? I'm at
Yeah.
this node, this introductory node. What are the children from this node, right? and
Right.
and again, it's one of these things where I find it's very much a mindset thing. Another example I give is with music, right? There's piano player Bill Evans, who he has this interview where he talks about the creative process. And just to draw a comparison with Tim Ferriss, when Tim Ferriss starts the cooking book, he talks about chopping, how to chop vegetables, right?
Hmm.
In the piano example, it's like, okay, this is how you play this scale, right?
Hmm.
In the mathematics example, in my case, right, you start with algebra, and then you sort of advance into calculus, and you advance into other more advanced topics, right? But in all of those cases, I feel like where people get stuck, and why I think introductory materials sort of, they can be deceptive, and sort of sometimes it's good to stay away from them, actually, is that I think psychologically we all want to be advanced right away,
Oh yeah,
right? And I
for
and I,
sure.
and I catch myself with this, making this mistake all the time, right? Where
Yeah.
I start learning something, I want to be advanced like tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And so I find that sometimes, it's about getting out of our own way, and in terms of saying like, okay, I'm not going to be Beethoven tomorrow again, right? Using the
Hmm.
piano example. Let me start with Mary Had a Little Lamb. I don't like that I'm playing Mary Had a Little Lamb, but let's see how I can make that the most fun song that I
Let's make it
can
the best
play for
damn
now, right?
Mary had a little lamb ever.
What's that?
Let's make it the best damn Mary had a little lamb
Yeah,
ever.
exactly, right? Seriously,
Yeah.
seriously. And so, I think, when you go on YouTube, or you type in something in Google, you'll find like a Medium article that's super popular, and it'll give you sort of a crash course in a topic. But
Right.
it's sort of catering to that instinct, right? It's feeding that illusion that, I could become a master in this in 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's going to take 10 years, right? Where there is, if you there is a tactical element to learning, right? And so it's not like, something necessarily needs to take you 10 years. If you're following correct learning tactics, you
Hmm.
can learn something in half the time as another person. But the
Right.
point is that you're not going to, regardless of how good your tactics are, you're not going to learn it overnight, right? Or in a
Yeah.
week. There's sort of this middle ground area, right? Where it's just, some of us are naturally faster than others, but even someone who's extremely bright, I don't know if you follow chess at all, but both of us got into it after the Queen's
Oh
Gambit,
yeah.
right? Yeah, right. And so this guy Dubov, I hadn't heard of him, but he eliminated Magnus Carlsen from a tournament recently, and and when I was reading an interview about him, he said Dubov, he's like 24 years old, something like that. He's like, I have no illusions about the advantages I've had in my life, and the
Hmm.
advantages were that he was born into a chess family.
Wow.
And so he talks about how, as a kid, there were kids way
Right.
better than him at chess, but they didn't have the same opportunities to progress because they lived in like on the outskirts of Russia. They didn't live sort of in the central parts of Russia, and so they didn't have the same access to tournaments,
Right. Right.
and they weren't able. They plateaued just because the opportunities weren't there, right?
Yep.
And so even when you're looking at the grandmasters of a field, right? There's grandmasters of React, there's grandmasters of you can pick your
Yeah.
random topic and there's going to be a grandmaster in that area. Most of them usually took them a while to get there, right?
Right.
And
Right.
they had, so it's a balancing act, right? It's this constant balancing act of and I should be giving myself this advice more often, but like appreciating our own humanity and the fact that it takes time to learn things and getting out of our own way in that
Right.
regard, giving ourselves a chance to kind of learn the lay of the land before we try to be masters.
Right.
But at the same time, being mindful of being tactical in our learning, right? Not time alone, time passing alone will not make you learn something either, right? So it's
Hmm.
this interesting balance, right?
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
So, like, from my perspective, like, at least from my experience when I've taught other people or had to train new team members and things like that, the way I managed to get them to start to learn things in depth is basically you got to build things, right?
Hmm.
And especially when it comes to programming and developing. Another one was taking something that was complex, so like a complex repository, and writing the
Yes,
tests for it. Because when you start learning to write the tests for things, then you see how things are connected. What things are pointing to each other, what things are talking to each other, and from there you can kind of get a better idea what the big picture looks like and how something
for
is
sure.
designed. So you're getting past just the syntax, or you're getting past just those introductory topics.
Yes.
So that for me that was like one
And
way that
sorry,
helped
yeah,
them.
I kind of, maybe my answer is too philosophical. I should give a concrete version. And you're right. I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about programming, right? And it's kind of one of the appealing things to me about it is that, unlike the examples I mentioned, like with cooking or piano or chess, all you need is really a computer
Yep.
and an internet connection. You know
Yep.
what I mean?
Basically,
Like
yeah.
that's all it takes. And that's one of the amazing things is that excuse me, you can pick a random component or a random that I feel like there aren't enough resources on that.
Hmm.
Introductory projects,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's something that I wish there was more of, right?
Hmm.
And if you go on GitHub, it's true. I mean, one thing you can do is sort of take a component, a subcomponent of a repo and work on it, write tests for it. But sometimes, what I'll look for is what's the hello world of,
Hmm.
right? Mary had a little lamb. The analog for programming is hello world, right? And
Right.
most computer science programs, you start with how do you do hello world in this programming
Yeah.
language, right? But when you're looking at higher level projects, right, you want to write it. I remember you mentioned to me like writing a to-do list application,
Right.
right? Starting with writing a to-do list application, but I would even go further down than that, right? It's
Hmm.
like when it comes to web development, for example, that's another interesting area where, because there's a design element, you can
Right.
really pick some very simple examples that you can start with, right, as an exercise. So
Hmm.
I love that idea, that example. I do that all the time, right?
Yep.
It's what's the hello world at this level? Every time you go up a level, you have to figure out like what's the hello world of
Of
X.
this,
You know what I
exactly. Yeah.
mean? And
Exactly.
and and figuring out the answer to that and then going and doing it, right?
Yep.
And you can get really far with just that pattern
Yep.
of every time you move up a level, asking yourself that question. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And that's to me that's a big thing. Like doing it is the hardest
Yeah.
part actually, because it's
Yeah.
easy to read something and think to yourself, oh yeah, I get it. But once you start trying to
Yep,
actually do it, that's where really, it puts you to the test. So
it's true. No, I agree. I love that's again one of the beautiful things about programming is that it's this lovely balance of theory and practice,
yeah,
right? You can consistently sort of bounce back and forth between theory and practice and programming,
yeah.
which is one of the great things about it. Yeah.
So from your years of experience now, Robbie,
Yeah.
uh, what resources or tools have you found the best in your opinion that you've used and have worked well for you?
Yeah. So I'm very much like a systems guy, especially as I get older. I mean, I'm not that old, but I mean, as I get older, I'm trying to, I'm always seeking out systems, right? And the tools, I'll comment on that first, and then I'll comment on the tools I use because most of the tools I use are sort of reflections of some of the systems that I've learned.
Right.
And so I'll just take an example from a productivity standpoint, right? So for a while, especially when I got this lead role, even before actually, as soon as I started juggling multiple projects, I had trouble managing tasks,
Right.
right? And so I learned about the getting things done system, which is interesting. It actually came out around the same time as the Agile Manifesto, like I
Oh,
don't know how
nice.
long, 15 years ago or something.
Yeah.
And it's based on this guy. I think his name's David Allen. And the idea is that your mind is for having ideas, not storing them. That's sort of the
Right.
big takeaway of his system, right? And
Hmm.
so, as you're sort of living your life, and most of us can relate to this, random things you have to do pop into your head, right? I
Right.
have to do the laundry. I have to, get more some eggs. We're out of milk. And so the idea is that you sort of there's a capture phase, right, where you capture the task and then you later schedule it, maybe make it part of a larger project, etc. And so it worked really well for me. Like when I started implementing that system in terms of juggling multiple things, sort of stress-free productivity, right?
Right.
That's how it's advertised. So, anyways, because of how passionate I am about learning, I asked myself the question like, is there something like this for learning?
Right.
Is there like a getting things done system for learning? And it's interesting if you Google this, if you try learning about learning, there's some interesting systems out there, and they're not all bulletproof, but one of them's called Zettelkasten. I'm not sure if you've heard of
No, never heard of
Zettelkasten.
this.
Yeah,
No.
it's this weird I don't know if it's a Swedish word or a German word, but I'll send it to you after the chat. You can put
Sure.
it as a
Yeah,
resource
I'll
in
put
the
it in the show
episode.
notes. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's this academic basically. He was a sociologist who was known for writing a bunch of books, like maybe 20 books he wrote in his lifetime or more,
Hmm.
academic books, like really dense books. And he had a system sort of similar to like a commonplace, what's called a commonplace book,
Hmm.
um, where he would because if you think about it, sorry, just to take a step back before I go into that, what we're really doing when we're learning, this was the big insight for me, is we're really like acting like researchers, right? So if you imagine you're sort of an academic researcher, what they do is not that dissimilar, right?
Hmm.
They have to look up papers, they have to manage, their resources. Maybe they read one paper and it's not so good. Maybe they read another paper and there's an insight in there that they want to use in their research. And so, I sort of was trying to take a page out of their book of how do they manage these things, right? And
Hmm.
so the system that he used basically was you split up how you're managing your notes, basically, which is Zettelkasten really means, I think, slip box. He had this giant wall of these little tiny wooden slip boxes where he put note cards in
Okay.
them, right? And so when he came across something that he was reading, he'd sort of write it down on this note card, and then on the back he'd reference, where he
Hmm.
where he found that note,
Sure.
right? But the key piece about it was how he connected notes together. And this is where when I was doing this research about finding an analog to getting things done for learning, the one difference between productivity management or task management and learning management
Hmm.
is that there's a connectivity piece with learning, right? where, you find one insight one place, you find another insight in another place, but then there's a connection between the two.
Right.
And so the question is like, now how do I manage those connections? And so in the case of the Zettelkasten, he put a little number, like an index in the top right corner.
Mm-hmm.
Put like a 1 or a 2 or something like that. And then when he'd find another note that was connected, he'd tie the indices together. So sort of like a manual wiki
Okay.
that he made with
Yeah.
with this giant. I'll send it to you.
Ancient
It's
hyperlinks.
really funny to what's that?
Ancient hyperlinks.
Seriously. It was
Interesting.
ancient hyperlinks, and it's hilarious to look at. It's just this giant wall of little wooden slip boxes.
Yeah.
And so when I was looking up, okay, is there a digital way to do this, to implement
Right.
this kind of a system where, you're managing your notes, and then you're able to sort of make connections between them, and, you're able to organize those connections in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And so the two big ones right now on the market are Notion and Obsidian,
Right.
right? And it's funny, and Rome is another popular one now that's used by researchers. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're called backlinks, right?
Okay.
Where you embed one note into another, and then there's sort of a digital connection that gets made. I'm actually interested in how they made it, as an application itself on the
Yeah.
back end. It's very interesting. No, really, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Definitely.
you can visualize the graph in Obsidian. It's actually really interesting to look at. Like, you can visualize the connections between all your different nodes and see where there's, a high, for people who studied graph theory
Mm-hmm.
in school, the degree is high for a particular node. There's
Right.
maybe, 100 edges
Right. Right.
tied to this node. You're like, oh, what's this topic over here, right? But it's funny. So Notion, for a while, didn't have backlinks.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't until I think 2 months ago or 3 months ago that they released that as a feature, because it was the main issue that people had with it, because this connectivity thing is sort of the key thing with learning, right? So anyways, right now, the one I'm using is Notion.
Yeah.
I
I
was
use it
using
too.
Obsidian, and then once Notion introduced backlinks, I felt like it was game over, and
Yeah.
Notion won. Yeah. So really,
Yeah.
that's the only advantage yeah, Obsidian has other advantages. You can use just local markdown files. You don't have
Right.
to, rely on their backend or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's sort of the system I use. You could implement it in a variety of different ways, but it's easy to, there's this infamous pattern of, like, you have your Pocket extension, and you're constantly bookmarking things, and then you have this sea of bookmarks, and you don't know where to find what, and
Yeah.
you don't know how to manage your learning. So for me, even I have it across PDFs, right? Like, again, like a researcher, a researcher is gonna want to know who the author of the paper was, right?
Right.
If it's
Right.
part of a particular journal, like citations, a bibliography of
Mm-hmm.
sorts, right? And so in Notion, I have sort of a section for books where, if I'm summarizing a particular section in a book, I have a direct reference to it inside of Notion, right?
Right.
So that's roughly, you could do an entire episode just on that, honestly,
Yeah.
on how to use these sort of para is another one. It stands for, so the para method, it stands for projects, areas of responsibility, resources, and archives. So it's out of Fort Labs, and it's sort of similar to Zettelkasten. Zettelkasten's sort of the older method. I haven't read too much into it.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all Dutch companies. Seriously, Todoist is a Dutch company. I'm pretty sure Fort Labs is a Dutch company. Zettelkasten, that I don't know. It's from some Scandinavian country, but they like order, right?
Right.
And I think actually it's funny. David Allen, the creator of GTD, I'm pretty sure he lives in Sweden now. Yeah.
Just to satisfy that, to satisfy that need
Seriously,
for order.
seriously.
That's
And
funny.
so, I encourage anyone listening to, read up on Zettelkasten, Para method. Listen to some David Allen talks about, you want it to be on autopilot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Learning is stressful enough as it is, right? Just trying to grok something
Yeah.
is stressful enough, right? And
Right.
so I like, David Allen's the one who sort of turned me on to this idea of trying to put some of these things on autopilot, so that you can sort of focus on what matters. And in this case, it's just literally trying to understand the thing you're staring at in
Yeah.
that moment, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I encourage anyone listening to research any of those topics to
Cool.
help them
Yeah,
implement
we'll
those
definitely
systems.
put all
Yeah,
that in the show notes. That'll be really good
yeah,
for
yeah.
everybody.
I'll send it to you for sure. Yeah.
Amazing. Is there anything else you wanted to add to this topic, Robbie?
No, I'm assuming how long has it been now? Has it been an hour
Uh,
already?
it's almost been, I think. Well,
Okay.
we're about 45 minutes, I think, or so.
No, no, no. Honestly, I mean, I'm just happy, like I said, that I was able to participate in this. I'm excited to see what comes out of your podcast, and just keep me posted on the editing and stuff. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm just I'm happy that you're starting this, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's a
thanks.
really nice topic that I think to start with
Definitely.
for this. So
I think there's even more we can even add to it in a future episode as well.
yeah,
So
for sure.
we'll definitely keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
So thank you, Robbie. Is there anything else you want to plug or mention while you have the chance?
Uh, no, I mean, like I said, I mean, I've been thinking of um, asking to be a co-host or to participate in some way in the future.
Sure.
Nothing to plug. I don't have a business yet or anything. Or
Where can we find you
you
on
can
Twitter?
follow me on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter. Yeah, at RobbieNohra.com. Not .com. Sorry, at Robbie Nohra.
Cool.
I can send that to you as well. And yeah, I'm reviving my interest in my blog. There's not much there, but at some point I'll probably send that to you as well to plug
Perfect.
that maybe. Yeah,
Perfect.
but nothing else for now. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks so much for
Yeah.
joining me today, Robbie.
Yeah.
It's been really
Yeah. No
insightful
problem.
having you on, and it's always good chatting with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
So
too.
thank you for joining us on another episode of Ready for Dev. Actually, our first episode, episode
Yes.
0. Be sure to
Yes.
smash the like button and subscribe below. You can leave your questions in the comments of our videos, send us a message on Facebook, or drop us a DM on Twitter at Ready for Dev. The next time you're blocked on a ticket trying to figure out how to design a solution, or if you're just trying to break into the software development industry, feel free to drop us a message. Ready for Dev is brought to you by Vixel Corp at vixelcorp.com. I am Raymond, and you can follow me at Raymond Sue on Twitter.